The air inside the Geneva press room was crisp. Rows of journalists sat buzzing with excitement as world leaders discussed Africa's new economic alliance. Cameras rolled.
Oh.
Screens blinked and whispers filled the background. Suddenly Donald Trump stepped forward, flanked by aides. He wasn't scheduled to speak yet, but he pushed aside a security advisor and grabbed the mic. His voice, sharp and bitter, cut through the room. Ibrahim Traoré is a danger to U.S. interests in Africa, he snapped. He's destabilizing progress and cozying up to anti-American regimes. If this continues, the U.S. will respond harshly. A gasp rippled through the room. Journalists froze, even the translator paused. Tro, seated calmly in the front row, didn't flinch. He simply looked up, eyes steady, lips pressed. A child watching from a living room in Ouagadougou clutched his mother's hand. The broadcast was on every screen across the continent. Trump's face hardened. The U.S. doesn't play games, and with that he walked off stage. The room stayed silent for almost 12 seconds, and then the world began to shift. In a modest village outside Bob Dulasso, a woman named Adama sat in front of a tiny, flickering TV. Her son Madhu, just 10 years old, stared widely at the screen. "Mama, why does Trump hate Captain Traoré?" Adama didn't answer right away. Her eyes glistened. Her heart-pounding. Traoré wasn't just a leader to her. He was hope, the only one who made people believe they mattered. The man who 3 years ago gave her brother a proper burial after terrorists destroyed their home. She turned to Madhu and said softly, "Because some people fear voices that rise without permission." On the TV, American anchors debated possible sanctions. Images of war, economic threats, and diplomatic withdrawals flooded the screen. Hashtags trended. Stand with Traoré, African resistance, USVs, Africa. In a Geneva hallway, Traoré quietly stepped away from the cameras. He didn't shout, he didn't argue, but the fire in his eyes was unforgettable. "I will not let my people be silenced," he told a close aide. Meanwhile, in Washington, intelligence officials huddled. A document labeled "Africa Strategy Urgent" was passed across the table. The world had just turned, but no one knew where it was heading. It was 2:47 a.m. in Washington when the call came. National Security Advisor Grant Mercer sat bolt upright. His phone buzzed with alerts. "Global backlash building. West Africa unites us. Interests in danger." On the other end of the line, the president, calm but firm. What did Trump just start? Within minutes, top officials were on a secure line. They watched clips of African citizens flooding streets in peaceful protest, holding signs, "Don't touch Traoré. Africa is not a pawn. Dignity has a new name." Across 22 African countries, embassies were on high alert. People were marching not in anger but in painful pride. In Geneva, True finally appeared on the press stage. He wore no makeup, no script. He looked directly at the camera. "Africa deserves respect. Our children are not chess pieces, and if standing for our dignity is called war, then so be it." The room erupted, not applause, but emotion. Some cried, some trembled. Even the American reporter lowered his pen. Traoré's voice was not loud, but it shook the world as the world watched Trump's outburst on live TV. A small classroom in Bamako. Mali paused their lesson. The teacher, Madame Aminata, switched on the projector as students stared at the headline, "Trump calls Traoré a threat to U.S. interests." 11-year-old Musa raised his hand. "But isn't Traoré the one who gave us school books? Why is America angry with him?" Madame Aminata's eyes filled with tears. She remembered last year when Traoré personally visited after floods destroyed their village. He didn't send aides. He came himself, hugged the elders, and helped rebuild. She turned to the class. "Sometimes, when a man stands for his people, the world gets scared." Meanwhile, on the streets of Lagos, protesters clashed, some supporting Trump, others waving flags, with Traoré's face shouting, "Africa must stand." In Washington, journalists demanded clarity. Was Trump speaking as a private citizen or on behalf of future U.S. policy? Back in Geneva, Traoré sat alone in his hotel room. He stared at his phone. His mother had texted, "Don't break my son. Africa needs your heart." He wiped his face and stood up at the Pentagon. A red file was quietly slid across a polished table. On it, "Africa Strategic Response Plan." Eyes only inside were 3 words in bold. Economic pressure, media surveillance, diplomatic isolation. 1. Official hesitated. You're saying we punish Burkina Faso because Traoré speaks with courage, another replied coldly. We're not punishing courage, we're protecting influence, the order was clear. Watch Traoré weaken him silently. Never let him rise, but the world was watching too in Senegal. A group of mothers prayed near a photo of their sons, young soldiers lost in the fight against terrorism. One mother whispered, "If not for Traoré's forces helping us, our boys would have died in vain." In Kivuar, a journalist leaked word of a sanctions draft being passed around. U.S. agencies, why punish a man feeding villages and uniting borders? Social media exploded. Africa stands W. Traoré is hope end colonial control in Geneva. Traoré got the news. A soft knock came at his door. It was the un-African delegation captain. The continent is behind you. His jaw clenched. He nodded and said, "Just 6 words then. We fight without raising fists." In a quiet hospital in Ouagadougou, 9-year-old Zara watched the news from her hospital bed, bawled from chemo tubes in her arms. Her world was mostly white walls and soft beeping machines. Her favorite moment of the week when Captain Traoré visited the children's ward, bringing books and mangoes, laughing and holding their hands. Now, as she saw Trump shouting on TV, she turned to the nurse. "Did I do something bad? Why is he shouting at my president?" The nurse knelt beside her, struggling to hold back tears. "No, sweetheart, you're brave, and so is he." Zara picked up a crayon and began to draw. Her hands were weak, but the image slowly formed. Captain Traoré holding the hands of children in a storm. Behind him, a giant American shadow loomed, but he didn't move. She wrote, in big wobbly letters, "Don't be scared, Captain. We're with you." That image went viral within hours in Geneva as Traoré prepared for a press briefing his aide showed him Zara's picture on a tablet. He stared at it silently, then whispered, "I must not break, not when they still believe." He stepped onto the podium, ready for the world at exactly 3:14 p.m. Geneva time. A whistleblower in the U.S. State Department leaked a classified document to the press. The title: Proposal for Economic Pressure on Burkina Faso Draft Sanctions. It wasn't speculation anymore. America was moving. In Nairobi, journalist Kevin Odambo read the memo live on air, his voice trembling. It says, and I quote, "Captain Traoré's leadership poses a long-term threat to U.S. investment strategy across the Sahel." African Twitter exploded. Hashtags like "Hands off Africa" and "Traoré did nothing wrong" were trending in 40 countries. In his Geneva hotel room, Traoré watched in silence. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in sadness. His people were being targeted. Not with weapons, but with poverty. Then his phone buzzed, a message from a Kenyan farmers group. "Captain, we'll eat leaves before we betray you," he smiled. But only briefly. Outside, the press waited. Inside, a storm was forming in Nigeria's capital, Abuja. The African Union held a secret meeting. Cameras weren't allowed, but phones recorded everything. A well-dressed West African president stood and said, "Maybe we should distance ourselves from Traoré. America is not a small enemy." Gasps, a moment of silence. Some leaders looked away. Others nodded subtly. But one voice cut through the tension. President Sissoko of Mali stood, voice shaking. "You want us to abandon a man who fed your starving villages, who stood with your soldiers?" When no one else would, there was no reply. Meanwhile, the video leaked. It reached every corner of Africa, in Accra, Dar, Windhoek, and Yaoundé. Thousands marched in the streets, not with rage, but with tears. Women held signs reading, "Traoré is Africa's son. You do not sell your own child." A young man in Ghana cried on camera, "If our leaders won't stand for us, then we will." In Geneva, Traoré prepared to speak. He knew about the betrayal, he knew about the support, and yet his face remained calm, not because he wasn't hurt, but because his love for Africa was stronger than pain. That night, alone in his room, Traoré sat quietly. No bodyguards, no cameras, just him. His phone buzzed, a voice message from his mother. "And Kaya, my son, I heard what that man said about you. But remember, the day your father was killed, you said, 'Mama, I'll protect others so they don't lose their fathers too.' You've done that. You've given your people hope. If they turn their backs, walk forward anyway, your father would be." Proud silence. Traoré covered his face with his hand. For the first time that week, he cried outside his window. Thousands of African students had gathered. No one invited them. They came holding candles and flags. "We're with you, Captain. Don't bow, Africa stands." Some of them were only teenagers. Some carried photos of children who had died in terror attacks. Traoré had helped stop, and in the center of the crowd a girl held up a sign that read, "He cried for us. Now we cry for him." Traoré opened the window and the crowd roared. But all he did was place his hand on his chest and bowed not as a president, but as a son of Africa. The Geneva conference room was packed, over 60 world leaders, hundreds of journalists, the cameras, where live Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the podium, no notes, no script. His voice was calm, but everyone could feel the weight in the air. "I did not come here to defend myself," he began. "I came to remind the world that Africa is not for sale." He paused. "When you threatened sanctions, I remembered the little boy I met in Dori who said he'd rather have clean water than Wi-Fi." Murmurs in the crowd. "You see, our children don't need drones, they need dignity." Suddenly the camera panned to the U.S. ambassador. Her eyes blinked rapidly. "Mr. Trump accused me of undermining America, but I ask you, what do you call it when a child in Burkina Faso dies because rice prices were manipulated by foreign companies?" The room fell completely silent. Traoré looked directly into the camera. "Africa is not asking for pity. We're demanding respect." Many in the audience cried, others stood. It wasn't a speech, it was a wound spoken aloud. In a refugee camp near the border of Niger, 7-year-old Adama clutched a torn blanket. Her parents were killed 2 years ago by a militia group. Since then she had been silent, but something changed after Traoré's speech. A visiting U.S. senator arrived with a camera crew. His goal: evaluate humanitarian aid. He was shown around the camp, expressions stiff, hands in pockets. Fatima stared at him, then she did something unexpected. She ran to the senator holding a tiny folded paper. Inside was a drawing. Captain Traoré standing between a girl and a soldier with a gun on it. She had written in shaky French, "He didn't forget us. Why did you?" The senator knelt down, touched her head gently, and whispered, "I'm sorry." Later that night he posted the drawing online. The image went viral in Washington. Thousands protested outside Capitol Hill. "Sanctions kill children," read one banner. "Let Saw Africa breathe," read another. Even CNN covered it. Traoré becomes a symbol of forgotten children. Is the world finally listening? But back in Geneva, Traoré said nothing, because he knew this wasn't about him anymore. It was about every child who had been told they don't matter. Back in Burkina Faso, in the village of Yako, elders gathered under a mango tree. They had heard what Trump said. They saw the protests, and they remembered a day 3 years ago when Traoré came without cameras, without guards, to bury a boy who had stepped on a landmine. That boy was the chief's grandson now. The villagers had a message. They didn't have microphones, they didn't have media, but they had gratitude. They gathered food, hand-sewn fabrics, dried tea leaves, and gave them to a traveling journalist headed to Geneva. "Give this to our son," the chief said. "Let him know he is never alone." When the gifts arrived, Traoré was overwhelmed. He opened a small package. Inside was a pair of sandals, worn but clean. A note was tucked inside. "These were my sons. He wore them the day you gave us back our dignity. Now wear them so you never forget who you walk for." Traoré held sandals to his chest, eyes closed, silent. Then he whispered, "I will walk with them." And once again Africa stood behind him in the main press hall, and Geneva international reporters prepared for a final round of questioning. Traoré sat at the center, composed as always. The microphone passed to a young Trone, American journalist Alina Reyes, covering her first international summit. She stood, hands shaking slightly, and began. "Captain Traoré, some in the U.S. government believe," she paused, her voice cracked, "that you're a threat too. Got American stability, that your message may encourage Africa to reject us leadership. What do you say to them?" The room waited. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He leaned forward, eyes gentle. "When a child asks for clean water instead of loans, is that rejection? When farmers want fair trade instead of being told what to grow, is that rebellion?" He paused. "If dignity is now seen as a threat, then the world has forgotten its heart." Alina covered her mouth. A tear slipped down her cheek. She tried to ask a follow-up, but no words came. She simply nodded and sat down. Later she would write, "I came to interview a leader. I met a man who made the whole world remember what humanity sounds like in the dry village of Foden Germa." A woman named Mara Jama sat on a stool, her fingers trembling as she finished writing a letter. She was the widow of Sergeant Musa Bamba, killed in an ambush 2 years ago while protecting a convoy of schoolgirls. No one remembered his name except Captain Traoré. He visited her in secret. No camera, no speech, just sat with her, held her hand and cried with her. She remembered How he promised your husband's sacrifice will never be forgotten now. Watching Trump's speech on her small solar-powered radio, she felt pain rise again, but it wasn't sadness, it was fire. She gave the letter to a local radio host within hours. It went viral across Africa, her words. Mr. Trump, my husband, died protecting children who will never know his name. Traoré carried his coffin. You carry your words like weapons. If you knew pain, you wouldn't speak this way. People cried reading it. Some printed it and put it on their doors in Geneva. Traoré read it quietly, his hands trembling. She remembers. That's enough, he said. Outside crowds were waiting not for a speech, but for a moment that would define history. At exactly 4:38 p.m. Geneva time, Traoré's phone rang. It was Securus code on the screen. His aide hesitated. Captain, it's the White House. He took a breath and answered. On the other end was a senior U.S. advisor, calm voice, measured tone. Captain Traoré, the president wishes to de-escalate. There's concern about your growing influence. We suggest a joint statement, something neutral, Traoré said. Nothing, the advisor continued. You're becoming a symbol a little too fast. That frightens people. The markets are reacting. Finally, Traoré spoke. Tell your president I'm not chasing symbols, I'm chasing peace. Then help us cool the storm, the voice replied. Traoré looked out the window. Thousands of African students were waving flags, holding candles, singing softly, I didn't create this storm, he said, you did, and now you want me to silence. Thunder click. He ended the call. His aide whispered, Captain, was that wise? Traoré nodded slowly. When truth becomes dangerous, silence becomes betrayal. As night fell, the protest outside turned into a vigil. Africa was awake, and the world was finally listening. The United Nations General Assembly met under tension. A resolution was being voted on. Should sanctions be imposed on Burkina Faso under claims of destabilization? The U.S. pushed hard. Some European allies wavered. Africa was divided. But then something unexpected happened. As the delegates prepared to vote, the General Assembly Speaker paused. We've received a last-minute public submission from a civilian. Gasps filled the room. A video began to play on the massive screen. A small girl appeared, Zara from Ouagadougou's Children's Hospital. Bald, weak, breathing through a mask. Her voice was soft, but her eyes were full of light. I heard you want to punish my president, but he's the one who brought me books, the one who hugged me when I lost my hair. He made me smile when the pain got bad. Please don't hurt us. Silence. Many delegates cried openly. One even whispered, oh God. That day the vote failed, and the world saw not a president, but a man who had chosen his people's tears over power. That evening, Geneva's air was cold but electric. Thousands of people had gathered outside the press building. Africans, Europeans, Americans, students, elders, mothers carrying babies wrapped in flags. The crowd waited for Ibrahim Traoré, and then he walked out. No security, no jacket, just him. Someone shouted, we love you, Captain. Then another, you spoke for all of us. But it was when little Zara, now flown in secretly by a humanitarian organization, was brought on stage in her hospital gown, that the crowd went silent. Traoré bent down, hugged her gently. She whispered something. In his ear he nodded, and then holding her hand he turned to the world's cameras. This is not about me. It's about her future and yours. We have nothing to fight with except love and truth. If that frightens the powerful, then let them tremble. Zara's forehead, she smiled. That image went viral in less than 10 minutes. Celebrities, leaders, artists from Rihanna to Pope Francis shared it with one word, hope, and for the first time in years. Africa wasn't trending for poverty, war, or corruption. It was trending for dignity. That night across the continent, people stopped what they were doing in rural villages and busy cities on broken radios and glowing smartphones. They watched. Mothers cried quietly. Men nodded with tears in their eyes. Children stared. Why did a taxi driver in Kampala said, for once they see we are not weak. In a crowded rooftop, in ARA, young people danced not in joy but in release, and in Burkina Faso, candlelight lit every window. Traoré returned home. Quietly, no grand parades, just a soldier walking through the people, but one woman stood near the palace gate, his mother. She opened her arms, he walked into them, and rested his head on her shoulder. You did well, my son, she whispered, and for the first time since the storm began, he smiled, not for the cameras, but for home. Now, dear viewer, if This story moved you if you felt even one tear drop while watching if you believe. Africa deserves peace, not punishment. Please like, subscribe, and drop a comment right now. Tell the world. I stand with Trey. Your voice matters. Let this video be proof.